Hi everybody. This lecture we are going to talk about the ancient civilizations of Rome, China, and India. Now, the Roman Empire, to its greatest extent, takes up most of Europe and parts of the Middle East and North Africa, going from Spain and in the west to Turkey in the Middle East, to North Africa in the south, and all the way about 3/4 of the way up in England, almost to Scotland area. And so this is going to be the greatest extent of the Roman Empire, and is also going to, like other cultures that we've seen in the past, really put a mark on its influence in these regions for hundreds and even thousands of years to come. And so when we look at a lot of the civilization, when we look at a lot of the cities of the Roman Empire, particularly Rome, we see the kind of sophistication and forethought, the planning that goes into the cities, the kind of modern day block system that we see in most cities now can trace its roots back to ancient Rome. And so here we see a symbol of a city layout, and really that kind of symbol of Roman reasoning and planning. Again, the forethought, the preparation, the planning that goes into building not just a convenient and easy to navigate city, but also one that's highly efficient in terms of not just moving from place to place, but also developing aqueducts and certain types of drainage systems and water systems in order to really maximize the efficiency of this particular layout. And so when we look at Rome, it really is distinguished from a lot of previous cultures in that it's broken up into two main groups, the patricians and the plebeians. Patricians being those landowning aristocrats, typically priests, lawyers, judges. We kind of think of them as the top echelon of society. And the plebeians, the more kind of poorer class, everyday citizens, craftsmen, laborers, merchants. And again, we see these distinctions not just in Rome, but we can compare that to times now and seeing different types of hierarchies in the economic and social status, social classes, economic classes. And for the most part, in Rome at the time, plebeians really chose a patrician as a kind of patron, representing that person in matters of law and social orders, really just having this kind of exemplar, this person who would not just be a role model, but that would also be a tutor, be someone that would help out if needed. And this type of kind of paternalistic system really reflected family culture as well. You would see this within the inner family, and then you would see this from the inner family to immediate neighbors to more kind of blocks within the city and so forth, expanding on to the entire city of Rome and the entire civilization. And so we can see that, and again, make those same comparisons to how we might see kind of a representative system in the United States, a system in which the family is a unit that operates in a specific way, and that family is a similar piece to how multiple families create a kind of neighborhood, and how maybe a neighborhood would raise and help individuals and kind of acts as that unit. And then that neighborhood would be the piece of a town, the piece of the city, and so forth. And so you see these representations moving up through the entirety of society. In roughly 260 BE, we see Rome get into a military conflict with Carthage, known as the Punic Wars, three of which really result as a means to acquire territory, islands in the Mediterranean. And it's through these wars that we really see a kind of third group, new type of citizen, the businessman, the middleman, really, of how we're looking at this social class and economic class system that really forms the type of power structure that is going to be present when Julius Caesar rises to power. It's actually with the defeat of Pompeii that Caesar leads his army and assumes dictatorial control over Rome, and then will remain in control of Rome until March 15th, 44 BCE, when he is stabbed not one, but 23 times on the floor of the Senate in Rome. And it's after Caesar that we get Cicero's influence on politics and rhetoric, really being a rhetorician, one of the first to communicate with the people in Latin, and really moving the kind of spoken and written version of language from Greek to Latin. And it's this that really makes a mark, once again, on where we see our development 2,000 years into the future, and the language of English, for instance, being based off of Latin roots and Latin words. Now, in Imperial Rome, the Senate granted Octavian or Augustus the authority over the entire empire. And it was Augustus who was really duty bound to the rule of Earth's people, to the citizens. And while we look at Augustus in certain sculptures, we see this type of idealized man depicted in a very young and vigorous way, choosing to portray himself in the best of lights, rather than what we often see when we look at, let's say, Greek philosophers or Greek politicians, thinking back to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, where we see their busts formed from an image of them at an older age. Now, while the language and culture began to change in Rome, it was also the case, because of this inextricably linked this linking between society and family and neighborhood and government, that we see Augustus really taking a focus on keeping the family situation as good as possible. Really, it became a crisis in Rome, the demise of the family unit. And so what Augustus did was tried to criminalize certain behaviors and pass laws that would prohibit what we would think of as poor family choices and behaviors, one of which we can think of like adultery, for instance, criminalizing adultery, and really trying to just promote that strong bonded family. Because remember, that strong bonded family was a symbol for the city, was a symbol for the government, was a symbol for the empire. And so one of the things that Augustus tried to celebrate, tried to promote, was growth in the family and prominence in women in Roman society. So really trying to build up the population of women as well in order to get everybody kind of on that um, good moral ethical standard to which they could be good family members, and with being good family members, being good Roman citizens. But in addition to being good Roman citizens and creating and establishing and trying to allow for the flourishing of Roman society, Augustus' primary and perhaps most overwhelming um, problem facing him was a crumbling infrastructure of Rome. And so Augustus put a lot of work and a lot of effort into really developing city works programs, public works programs, in order to rebuild the infrastructure, in order to bring aqueducts and um, uh, bridges and buildings essentially up to what we would consider a kind of a code, right? Making sure that things weren't going to be falling down, making sure that the city was going to run efficiency and be as convenient as possible for its citizens. And the aqueduct is quite an impressive feat, especially at this time. We see kind of this sense of running water, being able to utilize gravity to build these systems of archways and tunnels in order to transport water from one side of the city to another, also helping with that kind of layout of a grid system in Rome. And here we have an example of arches. And again, just the engineering feat that goes into creating the buttresses, that goes into creating such an elaborate um, architectural piece is incredibly impressive given the tools, given the time period, and so forth. Another big project was the Colosseum, which was essentially Rome's stadium where gladiators would fight, animals would fight, athletes would perform. And the Colosseum would roughly seat 50,000 people, which by even today's standards is a pretty large stadium. And you can see just if you focus in on the outer walls of the Colosseum in this picture, again, that system of archways that kind of creates not just um, uh, stability, not just function, being able to go in and through, but it also expresses the might of Rome at the time to create and build something so impressive as the Colosseum. Here again, we can see a kind of top view layout of the city, the baths and market, the basilica, um, and we can see this kind of a grid system that's going to allow the ease of movement and the ability to really create a system where waste and water can be efficiently transported. And so, taking from these arches, we can see symbols of archways like this all over the world, in New York City, in France, and it's really a kind of triumphal symbol. These columns that are connected in this archway that really symbolizes Rome's both political and military might, their ability to create and build such enormous feats. Here, a picture of the Pantheon, a cylindrical dome building, one of the largest in Europe before the 20th century. And again, thinking of the construction of trying to build a dome prior to even the Middle Ages prior to the 20th century is incredibly impressive, let alone to do this at the turn of the millennium. And it's this that people will see, and the impressiveness to which they will not only think of the building particularly, but the civilization that built this, that put this together. Now, a lot of the information that we get from Rome and Roman civilization of the time is from the excavation of Pompeii, the city of Pompeii, that was basically buried by ash after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And it's through this excavation that we find foods and paintings, furnitures, graffiti, pornography, different aspects of a Roman civilization that really highlights what was going on at the time and how people lived. And so we see not just the impressiveness of building big and great things, but we also see the usefulness and efficiency of the Roman Empire. The Domus, for instance, kind of a townhouse for wealthier class citizens, it included this kind of atrium where we would see a shallow pool incorporated into the structure for catching rainwater below the roof. And it's this type of multi-use engineering feats that, again, really stamps the Roman Empire and their ability to create and build these structures, not just for looks, but also for usefulness and the pragmatism of making life simpler and more efficient and convenient for the citizens. Now, switching over to early Chinese culture, when we look roughly at Chinese culture in comparison to Greek culture in the 300 BC time period, we see that the developments paralleled that of what was going on in Greece and the Middle East. And one of those was just the unification of a Chinese culture to begin with. One of the things primarily that unified China was fear of Mongolian invasion. And so under the Qin dynasty, China was able to build the Great Wall to keep out Mongol invaders, and in addition, really developed Chinese language, a unified language that is still primarily associated with modern Chinese language. So again, looking back to a Latin and Roman language being roots and basically the foundation for English and other languages in the West, we see with early Chinese culture, their language also being very helpful and foundational for even current Chinese language. Now, in 1700, roughly from 1700 to 1045 BCE, the Shang Dynasty comes to power and really focuses on Chinese literature, gets more of a focus from military unification to a kind of philosophical understanding of the world. Ideas reflected such as the yang and yin, and we see Taoism and Confucianism really coming from this period of time. And it's Taoism and Confucianism that, again, is going to be a important factor for not just religion, but also just a way of life and a symbol for how people are going to really live their lives Taoism and Confucianism, from a religious standpoint, are very complementary religions. Confucianism being very inner focused, control of oneself, control of one's desires and emotions, and Taoism very naturalistic, um, making sure that we're able to adapt and change to nature and to the environment. And so with Taoism, it really represents a desire to kind of transcend the material world and to be a part of that naturalistic universe. With Confucianism, on the other hand, the primary philosopher, teacher, Confucius, again, expressed and taught more of a self-discipline, taught of values of self-control and reverence to one's elders, virtuous behavior. And this lies at the core of the system, right? When we're able to control ourselves, when we're able to control our desires, then we're able to kind of expand that out to the family, expand that out to the town, the city, and to civilization as a whole. And so again, paralleling that kind of a Roman family um, symbolic foundation for society, the same thing is going on in Chinese culture. Now, as the Qin dynasty starts to emerge in 221 BC, it really marks the rise of imperial China. Again, kind of a move back to imperialism and expansion, military might. And this is something that, again, is going to be heavily influencing around the world, especially around Asia, and marks part of that kind of Confucius philosophy of promoting the self and then expanding that outward. And so once China is able to really kind of control and be in charge and be unified, then it can expand out its beliefs system, expand out its civilization and culture to nearby entities. And so it's during this time period of the Qin dynasty that we see the Great Wall being built. We see the ceramic soldiers, roughly 8,000 of them, life size, being constructed, recently of which have begun being excavated. And in addition, tombs and roads being built. Again, a time in Chinese culture where this kind of unification started. The dynasties prior to this had their kind of pockets of areas in China. Again, not very imperialistic until the Qin dynasty. And it's with the Qin dynasty and that kind of outward expansion that the leadership, the emperors, were able to consolidate all of China. Now, after the Qin dynasty, we move from that kind of, again, military grade imperialistic culture to a more flowering literary culture, where scholars were trying to restore the respectability of China as not this imperial monster, not this imperial power that just seizes and expresses its might militarily, but really creating a kind of a flourishing system, both through literary, but also through just creating more agriculture, creating more water for vegetation, more infrastructure, to really just kind of give China that sense of depth in order to, again, kind of give back to that naturalistic world. So again, it's all about that balance of being able to control, being able to seize the power, but then also being able to realize that the natural order of things is something that's unchanging, and nature is not something to fight with, but instead to work in order to kind of be in lockstep with and sync with. Now, during the time of the Chinese culture, we also see Indian civilization that's really developing. And before 2000 BCE, in the Indus River Valley, we see very sophisticated cultures. Again, when we think of things like aqueduct systems, while in Rome it's such an important and magnificent feat, these were not necessarily original to Rome. Other civilizations prior to the Roman civilization at the turn of the millennium incorporated these aspects to society. And with Indian culture came this caste system that's going to be very prominent in not just the religion of Hinduism, but also just the Vedic traditions and cultural social traditions of modern day Indian civilization, or modern day Indian civilization, kind of mid 1000 CE to 2000 CE. And it's through Hinduism that we see a very different type of tradition emerging, something different from religions that we see around the world, such as Christianity and Islam, even Buddhism, in that in Hinduism started off as pockets of different faiths and beliefs, and were consolidated into a more kind of formal belief system. We see it in the opposite way with other religions. Take Christianity, for instance, and the rise of the Catholic Church. And then we see that in roughly 1600 CE, we get the Protestant Reformation. We get the branching off of different branches of the religion. So we have Christianity, we have Catholicism, and then we have Protestants, and even within Protestants, you have different Calvinists or Lutherans or Baptists, just different belief systems, all with this kind of foundation that all started from one place. But Hinduism, on the other hand, started as these little pockets of belief, kind of came together with the consolidation of India, and really emerged out of that a kind of unified theme. And so Hinduism is one very interesting religion that we see as being not having hard set rules like other religions. In fact, with Hinduism, it's you might see atheist Hindus, you might see monotheistic Hindus, you might see polytheistic Hindus, and it's about interpretation more so than beliefs in certain gods. And speaking of the gods, there are three major ones within the Hindu religion: Brahman, Vishnu, and Shiva. But again, we can look at these three as being different facets of the same God. We can look at these three as being a hierarchy of Brahman, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. We can also think of this as more of just a helpful model to get us to understand the kind of creation of the universe. Either way, we can look at these three primary figures and we can still be Hindus regardless of our beliefs, particularly about these three. And what's most important is kind of the moral dilemmas to which we react to our dharma, to our duty as a human being, which is basically what underlies our existence and kind of that foundation for all Hindus. Now, comparing Hinduism with Buddhism, we see that Buddhism um, is a religion that some classify as a philosophy um, begun by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, the enlightened one. And the Buddha preached the Four Noble Truths, preaching the idea that the world is always changing, that there's suffering in the world, and that we need to rid ourselves of this suffering, and gives a eightfold path of really how we can avoid this type of suffering, how we can avoid the type of attachment that lead us down um, this path in order to get us to our enlightenment. And it's within the Maurya Empire that Buddhism really becomes established as the official religion of the state. And it promotes a sense of existence that goes against a lot of this Hindu teaching of the caste system. When we look at Hinduism, we see a kind of hierarchy of caste. We see a hierarchy of social and economic order. And with Buddhism, it's really a response to the kind of contradicting elements of Hinduism, right? Where we talk about the idea of kind of nature and having this kind of natural order to the world, and yet being placed in these certain classes. And so with Buddhism, we see a type of expression of equality within religion, within caste, within politics, and really just the humane treatment of all things living. And so, in addition to Rome, we also see the architectural feats in India. For instance, the Great Stupa, which is a kind of symbolic hemispheric dome that is not just something impressive to look at, but something that has religious meaning, something for the Buddhist, for instance, a kind of a diagram of the cosmos. And we talked about the impressiveness and the symbolic nature of spheres, of circles. And in India, these structures also served the purpose as being those kinds of symbolic structures.